So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our sessions on conservation policies, facilitating national and international efforts in Asia. My name is Ngoc Anh Nguyen, and I'm the policy coordinator from the Asia for Animals Coalitions. It's a pleasure to be here with you today as we bring together leading experts and advocates to discuss the critical importance of collaborations in wildlife conservations. The aim of today's sessions is to emphasize the need for streamlined and collective actions across the border. We will focus on how coordinations among the international conventions, regional and local organizations can foster a harmonized and impactful strategy for wildlife conservation. Additionally, we'll discuss the essential role of law enforcement in combating international wildlife crimes, which aligns with our ultimate goal of comprehensive animal protections. Now, let me introduce our distinguished speakers for today's sessions. Our first speaker is Sam English, the Wildlife Program Manager for ADM Capital Foundations. He is a researcher with experience working on a range of environmental issues in Asia, namely water security, cryospheric change, and wildlife trade. He has worked for ADM Capital Foundation since 2016, overseeing projects on wildlife trade and crimes. He has been a lead author on ADM Capital Foundation's reports characterizing Hong Kong's significance in the global wildlife trade, both illegal and legal. He is also overseeing work on the exotic pet trade, financial crimes, and convergence with organized crimes. And for our second speakers is Zannis Mavrogordato, a barrister, French advocate and arbitrator based in London. He's a specialist in international law, in particular international arbitrations, and has acted as counsel and arbitrator in international proceedings all around the world. During the course of his practice, he has also assisted animal charities, in international disputes against governments and advise on the tactical deployment of international law tools, including the threat and use of arbitrations and complaint procedures to promote and protect the interests of animals. But unfortunately, today, Zannis could not join us live, but he has kindly sent us video presentations that we will watch shortly. And our final and third speaker is Maya Pardo. Maya recently earned a postgraduate diploma in law and professional practice from King's College London. She wrote a guide called Rights of Nature Toolkit, How to Protect Rivers in England and Wales, and works as a research assistant in environmental law. She frequently volunteers with the UK Centres for Animal Law and is a trustee of the Animal Advocacy Project. Like Zannis, Maya could not be here today, but she has also prepared a video presentation for us. If you have any questions for Maya and Zannis, who are both not present today, you can still put it in the chat box and we'll forward it to them later after the sessions and get back to you on it. Thank you. Without further ado, I'm excited to invite Sam to kick off our sessions. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me just get up the screen sharing. So hopefully you can see a large picture of an iguana at this point.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all today. Yeah, it's my pleasure to really talk about the work that we do at ADM Capital Foundation, specifically looking at sort of the policy engagement and advocacy side of our work. So just a quick run through of what I'm going to cover today, really talking about how we engage, who we engage, why we engage, talking a little bit more specifically about some of the policy areas that we have had some success in, and then a few very quick reflections at the end. So a quick intro to how we do our work. So we're really fundamentally based upon, we do a lot of our own research. So when we try to get started in a particular work area, we want to try and understand the complexities and opportunities within that space. So to this end, within the wildlife program of ADM Capital Foundation, we've done some really sort of fundamental baseline analysis of the situation as regards to the illegal wildlife trade, but also the exotic pet trade in Hong Kong. And that's really helped us to sort of lay out a roadmap for where policy interventions might be necessary, and also to understand the legislative landscape so that we can start to work with lawyers, for example, or legislators to scaffold how that might be achieved. We then tend to produce a variety of supplementary and complementary data and resources. So those would be in the form of surveys, white papers, position papers, and letters. And then we engage very directly in the processes to the extent possible. So, for example, we've engaged with the Interdepartmental Task Force on Wildlife Crime in Hong Kong, which is a multi-stakeholder forum where you can basically directly engage with the Hong Kong government on wildlife crime issues. And we also we have a real focus, and I'm going to talk a lot more about this in a second, but building coalitions with relevant stakeholders who can help leverage, the communal voice, and really importantly, I think, coalesce around an issue. So uniting multiple voices, multiple stakeholders around issues of communal concern. We also do a lot around media engagement. So these are just a few of the articles that have been covering our work. And then we also, of course, as I think is common to everybody in this space, really try to engage and enlist the public in our advocacy work. But I think to maybe touch more specifically on the areas of interest today, I'd like to talk a lot about the coalitions and collaborations that we've been involved in. So one of the more recent initiatives that we've been a part of is a Hong Kong biodiversity expert group. And so this will not be familiar to most of you, I don't imagine, but essentially there's a process called the Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, sort of formulation and consultation that takes place in many countries around the world. Mainland China has recently concluded its latest plan, and Hong Kong is currently sort of riding the coattails and formulating its own plan. And one of the things that we've tried to do is be as consultative as possible. Now, often the government will have a public consultation. They will reach out to the general public to get their input. But we felt like there was a missed opportunity in this particular instance where experts could be consulted before it went out to everybody within Hong Kong. Not that they don't have valid concerns, but there are obviously experts within the city who have a unique insight and perspectives, which we felt were really important to get to the government before they'd really started to lock in some of their recommendations. And so essentially this is a coalition of, I think it's at least 100 experts from Hong Kong who are providing guidance to the government. So the main point I want to highlight here is that there are opportunities for bringing together all of the experts in a particular jurisdiction, and once you've coalesced around an issue, you can start to, I guess, spot check and identify those areas where there's greatest convergence, and also to figure out those areas where there is divergence. I think it's really important that as advocacy groups, we need to identify where we agree and where we disagree, and to the best extent possible, as far as practical, really present a united front to governments in particular, because that's really key, because sometimes they will actually play off of dissension between different organizations. Another context in which we engage, which I mentioned earlier, is the Hong Kong Wildlife Trade Working Group. And this is a coalition of about 100 different NGOs, researchers, experts, academics, who sort of unite around different environmental causes. And I think one of the most important outputs from that group, which has been meeting since 2016, was this report, Trading in Extinction, which I had the privilege to be a co-author on. And essentially, again, there's going to be a very consistent theme across all of my points, but effectively this is about convening all of the relevant stakeholders, uniting around a particular cause, getting all of the data into one place so that there wasn't this dissension in the ranks, I guess, and to make sure that everybody is really clear on the objective reality, that what the data is saying, and where we can have the greatest impact and affect the greatest and most positive change from the policy perspective. And another forum which we've engaged in, which is slightly different from the others, is actually United for Wildlife. So the idea behind this is that it's really about engaging the private sector, which is not a sector that we'd previously sort of enlisted in the wildlife space, but this is a really sort of, I guess, unique forum which was set up by the Royal Foundation, Prince William, out of the United Kingdom, but essentially was focused on combating illegal trade, but really trying to better contextualize the exposure, the risk, and the opportunity that for the private sector to engage, whether it's in policy, whether that's at government policy level or whether it's in their own corporate policy level. And one of the ways that we've been engaging in this process is to develop resources that help these private sector entities to better understand the situation, again, their exposure, the policy sort of imperatives, and the opportunities for where reforms could be made that could have consequences for them, both positive and negative. So just to zero in on a couple of different elements of our policy engagement. So being based in Hong Kong, we do a lot of work that's focused here. I'm also going to touch on CITES, and I'm also going to touch on something that's got the worst acronym known to man, the United Nations Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, and I'm just going to call it the CCPCJ from now on. But to give you a quick intro, so the reason that we work in the Hong Kong SAR is obviously we're headquartered here, but it's also a really, really essential node in the global trade of wildlife, and that's both the legal and the explicitly illegal facets of this trade. So you can see some of the summary statistics that we've got for the last 7 years. The last decade, actually. And it's obviously clear that there are thousands of seizures that are taking place on a very regular basis. It's worth a huge amount of money. It has a huge ecological toll. And we're drawing these species in from hundreds, dozens and dozens of different jurisdictions around the world, relating to at least 100 species, but it's absolutely more than that. And so we've often, as I think has been demonstrated by the literature that I shared before, we've tried to find those ways that we can intervene and engage with the government in a productive manner. And one of the areas where there is sort of a clear opportunity is particularly in the context of the illegal wildlife trade, because nobody wants to promote an illegal trade. And I think we can all agree that we would work against criminals, regardless of what facet of the criminal empire they're engaged in. And so it's not uncommon for us to see in Hong Kong these really massive seizures. And this one is just to highlight sort of the convergence and scale that we see in the wildlife crime space, specifically in Hong Kong. So this is from 2023, and was using some of the ocean-going vessels and river trade vessels that very commonly ply our waters. And you can see here a whole variety of species are implicated in this particular seizure. You've got fish maw, you've got pipefish. I think there's seahorses in the mix here, probably deer tendons as well, and also sharks. And as I say, this is not an uncommon type of shipment, but one of the angles that we felt was really important to sort of get a handle on is obviously the scale of this type of seizure and the diversity of products, not just the wildlife, but the diversity of other commodities, waste, and other things that were found in this particular seizure are very clearly indicative of very organized criminal groups being engaged in this form of crime. And so one of the areas where we've had particular success is in engaging the government in policy around making wildlife crime an organized and serious offense. And so what we've done is, and just to sort of relate it to the policy side, so obviously we're advocating for certain policies to be, reconsidered or reevaluated, and where there are opportunities to tighten up the legislation, increase penalties, do more to combat the criminals who are exploiting the system. But I think a really important facet of this work has really been to utilize the language, the rhetoric, the ideas that come from government documentation itself. So here is a discussion from our Legislative Council, basically our Parliament. And essentially you can see that they very clearly concede that there are criminal syndicates that are engaged in these offenses. And so that then sort of provides the opportunity for you to have a really clear dialogue, because clearly the government is in total agreement with our perspective. But what we do is we'll tend to use our data to demonstrate and corroborate that perspective. So what we found is, and we maintain a database of wildlife seizures that are being made in Hong Kong, and as part of our ongoing work, we always try to complement the advocacy with really strong data. And what we can find is that there are clearly criminal groups exploiting the system that are well financed. They operate at large scale. They're very clearly transnational. They're very coordinated with lots of different actors engaged in these offenses. There's a huge diversity of species, as I mentioned at the top, and they're also mixed with other commodities. So, it's not just about the wildlife, it's about convergence with other forms of crime. And so, armed with sort of the language and the understanding, we were able to engage more directly with the Legislative Council. And we proposed to them sort of the ways that some of these issues could be ameliorated, and particularly in the form of a white paper, and engaging directly with particular legislators who we knew had a particular interest in trying to combat this wildlife crime. So this is just an example of policy intervention at that very local level. As I mentioned at the top, we also engage in CITES processes. For those of you who are not familiar, CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Another mouthful, I'm just going to call it CITES from now on. But essentially, this is subdivided into 3 different appendices that relate to the trade in some of the world's most endangered species. If it's in Appendix 1, there is an understanding that it's amongst the most acutely threatened by trade. If it's in Appendix 3, that's generally more of sort of a specific national jurisdiction that relates to it. But fundamentally, any species that's under CITES is believed to be, to some extent, threatened by trade, and that there needs to be an effort to rein it in. And why is this relevant for Hong Kong? As I said at the outset, Hong Kong is a major trader, and we can see by volume, Hong Kong is actually the 3rd largest importer of wildlife products by volume. The species that we dominate in include crocodilian meat. We are dominant in the mammal-based medicinal trade, and shark fin, as I think will come as no surprise to anybody. But then you've also got other products like shark skin, which may be more of a surprise. And what we're seeing over time is that there's this increased diversity. So it's really important that we understand how Hong Kong is actually implementing and adhering to this international policy, and look for those opportunities to align the local policy with the international policy and vice versa. And this was particularly acute. The sort of the trade increase, or at least the increase in diversity, is particularly tied to our really abundant trade in exotic animals, live animals for the pet trade. So we've taken a particular interest in this space over recent years, but I'm not going to delve into that too much. But that just kind of shows you that under CITES, Hong Kong's a really, really key jurisdiction. So engaging in this international process is really imperative and really essential, because if we don't understand these international processes, we can't really understand how well we're implementing them at the local level. And I mean, what I wanted to demonstrate with this slide is that there's actually an opportunity. Whilst some of these big conventions do seem quite big and scary, and it's really difficult to sometimes digest all of the materials that come out, sometimes they do give you sort of these breadcrumb trails, these little nuggets of information that you can use to leverage within your own jurisdiction. So one of the contexts where we've seen sort of both the influence of the local policy work that we've done, but also we're able to leverage the international policy engagement, is in the case of OSCO. So I mentioned before that the Organized and Serious Crimes Ordinance was something that we've been really pushing for a long time. And as of August 2021, that reform was actually passed into law in Hong Kong. And effectively what that meant was that they could start to use things like financial investigative tools, and treat wildlife crime as an organized and serious crime, which it truly is. And that was really excellent work. But what we were lacking is necessarily the cases that would affirm that. And I mean, there's a whole variety of reasons why that hasn't necessarily happened. But in the context of the international framework, you can see that the Hong Kong government was really keen to promote itself as taking, really progressive action. And that's great. That's fantastic. And we're all in favor of them promoting the work that they do. But what they do in that context, or what they've done in this context, is that they've said that this is a really key mechanism by which they'll achieve the objectives of CITES, which is excellent. But now, because they've put it into this international framework, it means that there's a lot more scrutiny from the international community on the implementation of that policy. So there's sort of this feedback loop that comes about by implementing that local policy, it being enshrined in these international policy documents, and there's an opportunity opportunity for you to advocate at the local level, that they actually do the follow-through work because they put it into that international domain, because there's more scrutiny, because it's not just sort of a local issue anymore. This is about contributing to the global conservation efforts. So that's just a quick point that I wanted to highlight there. And then there's another mechanism that we engage in, which I mentioned before, CCPCJ. And essentially, this is a United Nations entity, which effectively is the primary organ that guides the activities of the UN in the fields of crime prevention and criminal justice. So it's a really essential body, which is probably fairly unfamiliar to everybody. And one of the ways that we engage in this is through the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, or we term it EWC. And this really has sort of two pillars. It was created in June 2020 and works on wildlife crime and wildlife trade, and is really a natural sort of evolution of the work that we were doing. So I've mentioned OSCO, the Organized and Serious Crimes Ordinance work, and what we realized was, all of the problems, or many of the problems that we were seeing in Hong Kong, that Hong Kong was at the heart of, were really sort of emblematic of these global problems. And so again, it's looking at that local policy as an opportunity to figure out what are these broader problems that we're seeing at the global scale, and figuring out, that there are actually some of the ways that we were solving or addressing parts of the problems in our local policy context could actually be utilized and upscaled at the global level. And so ADM Capital Foundation is a host of this initiative. We work with many other amazing partners and champions to implement or try to scale up this work. And so in May 2022, after a number of years of sort of dialogues and engagement and trying to utilize the information and what we were seeing, credit to the member states for actually supporting and inviting the opportunity for a new global agreement that actually specifically deals with wildlife crime, which has been sponsored by a number of those member states, as you can see on the slides. I think you're probably already familiar with why it's important that we do this, but to reiterate, there's over 1 million species that are facing extinction if we don't change the course. There is a huge amount of profit to be made by the organized and criminal groups that are involved, not least, and obviously there's a huge amount of lost revenue to the government. So obviously they have a stake in this, and not least because we have to spend money fighting these crimes. And there's also a health imperative, which I think, again, will be very, very familiar to probably most of the people on this call. Now, I've obviously sung the virtues of CITES and the opportunities that you can have within that forum, but it's not the be-all and end-all. It's not the only mechanism, and it's limited in what it can actually achieve and do. Fundamentally, it's a trade mechanism. So we have to go beyond, and this is one of the reasons why we started to advocate in the context of the United Nations Treaty on Organized Crime, because we needed additional mechanisms to start dealing with it. And as I say, there's a lot of progress that's happened at lightning speed in this space, but fundamentally, the concession of the parties under the CCPCJ that there is a need has now basically been, everybody's coalesced around this perspective. There's some who are in explicit favor of this particular action being taken, and there's a very large tranche of people who are at least open to exploring it. And I think that that's a really heartening sign of the way that this international policy work is developing and is driving reform in a really positive way. And fundamentally, what this means is that there will be this mechanism at the international level whereby countries will hopefully align themselves to combat wildlife crime as an organized and serious offense. And now I'm going to conclude because I don't want to take up too much time. But fundamentally, what is clear from a lot of the policy engagement work that we've done is that there is a really clear need for us all to engage in policy at whatever level you can, whether that is, at the state level, the federal level, the provincial level. It's really key to utilize what your insights, and to engage in the process. I think there's a lot of issues that we as whether you're a frontline organization or an international NGO, there's things that that legislators won't. And if you want to be part of the solution, I think policy engagement, even just raising awareness of policy influences, is really essential. If you have the opportunity to then leverage and upscale that, then fantastic. And being able to do so, at the national, the regional, or the international level, that's fantastic. And every little bit helps. From our work, from the collaborations, I mean, I've skated over a number of the different collaborations, but we've been really fortunate to have partnerships with NGOs, with academics, with the private sector, and we've found that all of those engagements have yielded great benefits. And it's not always immediately apparent. Sometimes, I mean, particularly engaging in the financial sector, it's taken, I'd say, 4 years for us to get from just having talk shop meetings to actually impactful dialogues, engagement, meetings where we can actually talk about, where the policy isn't working from their perspective and our perspective, not just us telling them what our grievances are, and also finding opportunities for collaborative investigations potentially. It's all essential to building that trust. And once you have that trust, then you can really maximize and leverage the communal resources, manpower, labor, and sometimes financial as well. And I think probably one of the biggest takeaways, and something that we've recognized through our engagement in the CITES processes in particular, is that Asia, I mean, this is the forum of Asia for Animals, and what we've come to realize is that Asia is vastly underrepresented. I mean, certainly from a proportional perspective. I mean, I've advocated very strongly for Hong Kong's role in the global trade and in the context of wildlife conservation. But realistically, we play such a big role in nurturing and the biodiversity of our planet, and yet Asia never has enough bodies, at these conventions, in these meetings, in these fora. So I think something that we collectively have to work towards is getting more Asian representation into these spaces, more Asian voices, and engaging much more in these processes. I mean, I understand that's far more easily said than done. But I know that's something that AFA in particular is particularly keen to champion, and I would really strongly endorse that particular perspective, and really hope to encourage it over the coming years. So at that point, I'll wrap up my talk, and thank you very much for listening. Please feel free to reach out if anything was of interest, if you wanted to learn more about our work. I'd also really welcome any questions, because obviously this was a really quick drive-by of a lot of the work, a lot of complex work that goes on. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sam, for sharing those very valuable insights on how international frameworks can be leveraged to tackle wildlife trafficking and as a serious issues in Hong Kong and in Asia. Now we'll move on to the second presentations of the day. Although Zannis couldn't join us in person, he has prepared a video where he will share his expertise on international legal strategies to protect animal rights and welfare. Let's watch the video.
Hello, and thank you, first of all, to Ngoc Anh for the opportunity to speak today. My name's Zannis Mavrogordato. I'm a barrister specialising in international law, and my colleague Maya is a researcher and soon-to-be solicitor with a similar specialisation. We apologise for not being able to attend in real time, but we hope that our short presentations will give you an idea, at least, of the ways in which we might be able to assist you using our knowledge and experience of international law. I plan to speak for about 10 minutes now to give you an overview of the ways in which we might be able to help. Maya will then speak for a further 10 minutes to share her ideas, in particular regarding the complaint procedure under the recently updated OEC guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct. The first question that you might be asking yourselves is why international law is relevant at all to your ongoing projects. Surely you might think all you need to know is the domestic law of the country or countries in which you're operating your projects. And surely you might think that international law contains very few enforceable legal protections for animals. Now, there's certainly some truth in those sentiments, but I nevertheless want to try to convince you, and I can tell you from my own practical experience, that there is some practical benefit to international law. It can, in my view, play a useful and important role as part of a broader project or campaign. Let me explain a little bit why. Many of your projects will involve interactions with governments or government entities of some sort. Governments, or more precisely, states, are the subjects of international law, and they are therefore accountable under international law, not only their domestic law, for everything that that state has signed, be it a treaty, convention, or otherwise. Now, often in practice, the people within government with whom you will be interacting will have little or no knowledge of what their respective state has signed by way of treaties. So they won't necessarily know the international law position any more than you will. So in those circumstances, knowledge of international law can be a very powerful tool in any communication or negotiation that you might have with the government. Let me give you one practical example from an interaction that I've had in the past with an AfA group member. I'm going to keep the name of the charity and the country confidential, just in case of any sensitivity. But basically, about 10 years ago, this charity encountered a particular problem in the state in which they were operating, where a corrupt government official attempted to expropriate their sanctuary, intending to convert it into a theme park, believe it or not. Now, the charity were taking various steps to try to convince the government, obviously, to reverse that particular policy decision. But one angle that understandably they hadn't seen, and which I saw, was a possible claim under international law. So I went onto a database of international law instruments that I use on a regular basis, and I found a bilateral trade agreement between the state concerned and the home state of this particular charity. And under that bilateral trade agreement, there was a protection for NGOs in particular against expropriation, which is obviously the taking of an asset. So what we did is we drafted what's called a trigger letter, which is like a letter before action, before the commencement of formal international legal proceedings. And quite cleverly, the charity involved decided, rather than knocking the government over the head with this document, they decided instead to deliver it in draft and by hand to, I think it was a deputy prime minister, but it was certainly somebody quite high up in the government. And basically through that maneuver, and no doubt through other actions they'd taken, they managed to convince the government to reverse its decision to expropriate the sanctuary. So to be clear, I'm not for a minute suggesting through that example that the trigger letter or international law was the critical element in securing the return of the sanctuary. And I'm not suggesting that international law will always present you with a silver bullet in your interactions with governments, but knowledge is power. And I think the above example shows that international law can be a useful part of a wider strategy to help you achieve your objectives, whether you're combating an existential threat, as in that example, or on a more day-to-day basis, if you're simply drafting a letter to a government requesting them to provide support for your project, or if you're lobbying a government to introduce legislative changes or to establish a protected area for a particular wildlife species. In those sorts of contexts, knowledge of the relevant conventions that have been signed by those states can be a useful lever. Whether your projects are large or small, Maya and I would encourage you to contact us. We're willing to give you what we're calling an audit of your projects. It's perhaps a grander term than needs to reflect the reality. But we're happy basically to review your projects, whether through a call or through correspondence, to see if there are any ways in which we think international law might be able to assist as part of your broader project strategies. To be completely clear, we're happy to provide that audit and any follow-up work for free. We want to help you make a difference in the real world, and we're very aware that legal tools need to be deployed sensitively and pragmatically to help you achieve meaningful change. In addition, we have some concrete ideas for promoting conservation of animals and natural habitats, using, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity and the newly updated OECD guidelines. As mentioned, I'm going to leave Maya to discuss some of our ideas regarding the strategic use of the complaint procedure under the OECD guidelines. But I just wanted to spend a minute drawing your attention to the ongoing initiatives under both the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Berne Convention to promote the establishment and management of protected areas for nature. The Berne Convention have established a working group to monitor the implementation of their strategic plan to 2030, which is to establish protected areas for nature covering about 30% of the planet. And the Convention on Biological Diversity has a similar initiative, which is designed to implement the Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, it's possible for NGOs, such as most of you on this call, I suspect, to become observers to both of those processes, and thereby monitor and potentially play an active role in promoting the realization of these important goals. Applying to become an observer is an extremely simple process. Believe it or not, all you have to do is draft a short letter and send it to the Secretariat of the Berne Convention or of the CBD. We'd be happy to help you put together such a letter. And if you're thinking that the process of being an observer is just too much for you to deal with in terms of manpower or otherwise, or other resource, again, Maya and I are more than happy to be your representatives. We're happy to attend any calls, meetings, etc. on your behalf and to report back to you so we can take that burden off your plate. On that note, I'll hand over to Maya. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar. If there's anything you've heard so far, or obviously in Maya's presentation, that is of interest in any way, please do reach out to Ngoc Anh and she'll put you in touch with us directly. We'd be more than happy to speak to you. And I repeat, it's free. Thank you.
Thank you to Zannis for that very informative presentations. It's clear that international law offers powerful tools for advancing animal protections, even across borders. Now let's move on to our final presentations from Maya, who has also sent us a video. Maya's work in environmental law and her contributions to the rights of nature's movement offer a unique perspective on how legal frameworks can be applied to conservations. Let's go ahead and view Maya's presentations. Thank you.
I'm a legal researcher and a recent law graduate, and I'd like to thank Animals for Asia and Ngoc Anh very much for inviting us to speak today. So I'll just pick up on where Zannis left off. I'd like to start by talking about OECD complaints. So the OECD is a group of the world's richest countries, and the OECD publishes guidelines for multinational enterprises, for large corporations that are operating internationally. The guidelines were updated last year, and they now include a lot more around due diligence to do with environmental issues. So that means that a large company has responsibility throughout its entire supply chain to make sure that at every stage in the supply chain, the rules about respecting the environment are being met. They also added, thanks to the campaigning of many animal rights groups, they also added a section on animal welfare, and it tracks roughly with the 5 freedoms. And so that's where I think there might be some interesting complaints that you could potentially bring. So the way the complaints mechanism works is that every country that's part of the OECD has a national contact point, and a claimant such as an NGO can bring a complaint against a corporation to the national contact point, and then they will sort of engage in mediation, try to find out what's going on. They'll ask the company for a response. And it's a free process, so it's also not legally binding. However, the national contact point may issue a statement at the end giving the company some guidance on what they think they should do. And in some rare cases, it actually ends up with an agreement. So the way that, just to give you an example of how this has worked in the past, before the animal welfare provision came in, There could be something like a large mine being built in a country that's not an OECD member, for example, Vietnam, or a dam in Vietnam. And let's say the dam is being built by an Austrian engineering company. There are concerns about human rights violations by the workers who are building the dam, or concerns about environmental issues to do with lack of fish, pollution to the water, and the domestic campaigning has only gotten so far. So one thing that the claimants can do is the NGO can bring a complaint to the national contact point in Austria and ask them to speak to the engineering company, who are also responsible for their subsidiaries and smaller companies, local companies that are working for them. So a couple of ideas of how this might work for animal welfare, and this provision hasn't been tested yet. So these are just some ideas I wanted to throw out there just to make you aware. For example, let's say you have some footage of poor animal welfare on a farm from an undercover investigation, and you can trace that farm as providing meat to a multinational enterprise such as a large supermarket, or perhaps the farm has contracts or is perhaps owned by a meat packing company. You could then bring a complaint against the company for violating the animal welfare provisions if you have the evidence that the animals are not doing well, which we all know a lot of undercover investigations do show that. And you would need to find which OECD country the multinational enterprise had offices in. So there may even be more than one option, and there also may be different multinational enterprises involved. So you may even have a few options of which country to bring it in, and you could start a complaint there. You may want to think about how you're going to use it strategically. So OECD Watch is a website which is an excellent resource, which you may already know about. You can also become a member, and they have a lot of very, very helpful information on their website. But they do advise that you bring a complaint in combination with another campaign. So you could have a look at what campaigns are going on already in your area, or what campaigns are already being taken against that exact corporation. So, for example, debeaking. There are a lot of campaigns to stop the debeaking of chickens, or campaigns to stop the tail docking of pigs, or campaigns to stop cages for sows and for chickens. You could also, think more outside the box, and you could say you want to see the corporation invest more in plant-based food, for example. You can also bring some complaints under environmental issues if you're able to identify, for example, water pollution or air pollution, or overconsumption of water, which is coming from the factory farm. And remember that the entire supply chain should be involved. So animal feed, the growing of soy and corn to feed animals, uses a lot of water. So, in principle, that could also be part of your complaint. And then also on the other side, so factory farms produce a lot of waste, a lot of excrement, that becomes fertilizer, that can cause water pollution. I know in the UK, that's one of the leading causes of water pollution is actually fertilizer. So that could be another part of the supply chain, and you could include all of those in your complaint. So I'd like to just switch gears now and talk about a couple of other things you might want to consider. I'm interested in the overlap between environmental and animal law, and one area this comes up is in law reform. So there are three legal movements that have come about in recent years that could be interesting for us as animal rights campaigners. They are one, ecocide. You've probably heard about the Stop Ecocide campaign. The right to a healthy environment, and rights of nature. So I'll just go through them one by one. Actually, I'll start with the right to a healthy environment. So this law has become much more widespread, And you may even already have it in your country because it is starting to be seen in many countries. So I'll just give you an example of how this might help us in practice, and it has to do with greenhouse gases. So in South Africa, they have the right to a healthy environment, and it's integrated into their environmental laws. There was planning permission granted to an oil company to do some drilling. The campaigners argued in court that that violated their right to a healthy environment, and they argued that there needed to be a climate change impact assessment done before the planning permission and oil drilling could go ahead. And of course, oil drilling is going to produce a lot of greenhouse gases. So when I read about that, I thought that it might be something very worthwhile for us to use in our campaigns against factory farming, and in particular against any kind of dairy and beef farms, grazing, intensive grazing, or even deforestation, because there's a drawdown issue there. Of course, once you deforest an area, it's drawing down less CO2. A lot of deforestation is also to produce animal feed. So again, we have the supply chain argument. So if you do have the right to a healthy environment, you may be able to use it to strengthen your arguments when you're arguing for a climate change impact assessment or some other type of environmental impact assessment if you feel that the environmental impact assessment that's been done isn't adequate. So maybe it doesn't give enough information on where the waste is going to go from the factory farm, or how much water is being consumed within the entire supply chain, how much water is consumed by the animal feed that's being fed to the animals, for example. There's also ammonia is a big pollution issue around factory farms. So next, I'd like to talk about rights of nature. So this is a little bit less common than the right to a healthy environment, but there is a strong movement towards it. So the biggest example is probably Ecuador. They put rights of nature into their constitution in 2008, and they've had some varying degrees of success. A couple of interesting examples. There was a large biodiverse rainforest. A lot of mining licenses had been granted, unfortunately, and some people found a couple of very rare frogs that nobody had seen since the 1990s, in I think over 20 years. So they had been thought to be extinct. And they were able to bring a case on behalf of the frogs that the mining licenses would violate the rights of nature of the rainforest and of the frogs. So that's just an example how it might be, you might be able to use rights of nature to push back against deforestation and expansion of industrial scale developments like factory farms. Another interesting case also in Ecuador was where there was an individual monkey who had sadly died by the time the decision was made. But using rights of nature, they actually found that the monkey herself had rights and basically had the right to a good, proper, safe type of home and life. It was a bit of a complicated story that I won't get into. But I just thought that might be an interesting thing to think about, because it shows how rights of nature might be able to be used in the larger scheme of things as a stepping stone towards legal personhood for animals and animal rights. So in the United States, a lot of communities have had varying degrees of success with using rights of nature at the local level. So they're able to pass local bylaws, local ordinances, recognizing rights of nature, or for example, rights of rivers. And they've been doing this in part to fight against industries like fracking and factory farming. You know, every country will be a bit different. So in some countries, a local bylaw may really just be something that's symbolic. But the fact that it's happening at the local government level could still send a message to the national government that these communities or constituents want to see rights of nature. So that's another thing to think about. For example, rights of rivers is a big movement around the world, which has been spearheaded partly by in New Zealand to have rights of rivers. So a couple of rights that those would consist of would be the right not to be polluted. Rights of rivers would mean the right to be fed by sustainable aquifers. So right away issues around overconsumption of water, which is a big issue in, for example, aquaculture. So fish farming uses a lot of fresh water. And also the pollution that, again, that I talked about earlier that comes from factory farming may be violating the rights of rivers. So if you have rights of nature or you want to campaign for rights for rivers, that might be a way to strengthen the environmental laws to push back against the animal agricultural industry. Finally, ecocide. This is a little bit less common. So ecocide is comes from the idea of genocide. So it's the idea that there could be a criminal prosecution when there's large-scale mass illegal destruction of nature. This might be relevant when it comes to something like illegal fishing. So because we already have so much overfishing, when there's fishing happening that's without a license, without a permit, or outside the confines of the permit or in the wrong area, then it becomes illegal. And if it's happening a lot or over a long period of time or a wide area, that could potentially be called ecocide. So you may be able to use that as the threat of a prosecution. So again, if you have environmental groups in your area that are working on these three laws, this kind of law reform, you might be able to kind of join forces with them and make sure that they understand what the implications might be for animal agriculture, fish farming, overfishing, things like that. Then finally, just a couple of other quick ideas. There is the UN Special Rapporteur. You can file a complaint to them. Again, it's just about drawing some awareness, raise issues to the UN. While the UN doesn't have a lot of hard law capabilities, they are kind of the central place where a lot of new laws or new ways of thinking about things can happen and be spread and disseminated around the world. There's also the ESPO Convention, which is about transboundary impacts. So if there is deforestation happening or large factory farm installations being built anywhere near a border, there are going to be certainly concerns about water, about pollution, air pollution, water pollution, and then especially if it's deforestation, biodiversity loss. And so you can also submit a complaint to the ESPO Convention, and that has to do with the two countries looking at the transboundary impacts. There's also Ramsar missions. So if you're working with protected wetlands, which again can be at risk where there's a lot of agriculture because it uses a lot of water, the national governments can ask for a Ramsar mission, so they can ask for someone to come in and make recommendations and look at what's going on. And finally, I'll just mention that you can learn more about a few of those types of complaints in a booklet that I helped write, which is called A Rights of Nature Toolkit, How to Protect Rivers in England and Wales. I'll just repeat that again. A Rights of Nature Toolkit, How to Protect Rivers in England and Wales. And it has a few sections on international law and soft law international complaints. So once again, thank you so much for having me, and I just echo Zannis's offer that we're very happy to speak further if you have any questions or ideas. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya, for your insightful presentations. It's inspiring to see the legal strategies being developed to protect our natural environment. And thank you so much for sharing very practical and real-life stories to illustrate these cases. We will now move on to the Q&A portion of our sessions. Sam will be our sole speaker today for this segment, and I'm looking forward to lively discussions. Please feel free to ask any questions you have in the chat box, and I'll begin with a few questions to get us started. Sam, so the first questions would be about CITES. So the preparations for CITES meetings often requires robust data and research. How can organizations with limited resources leverage existing research or collaborate with academic institutions to strengthen their contributions?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it's probably a point that, you know, we were definitely in a very similar position of trying to figure out where and how you even begin to start getting this information in front of the right people. So I mean, we're really lucky in Hong Kong, where we've got a huge concentration of experts, NGOs, and people who do take a very active interest in this. So we kind of had a leg up in this space, kind of with the indications, well, with actual experts who engage and submit, for example, informational documents to the CITES process. But what I would say is, if you're kind of a newbie in this space, you know, there are entities. I mean, I know AfA has been discussing sort of how you can engage within the CITES processes. There's another entity, the Species Survival Network, which is really, you know, it's been set up by the likes of Born Free, who are also AfA members, and the work that they've really done, like they do an excellent job in really laying out, you know, what are the procedures, what are the meetings coming up, what are the issues that are very timely, who are the potential states that might have an interest in hearing from you. Because I think, you know, you in this space, you do have to understand that there's a huge number of interests vying. I mean, so fundamentally under CITES, as I said in my presentation, you know, it's a trade convention. So you are in direct competition, I guess, with traders who have a vested interest in seeing their trade continue within this forum. So, and countries have to balance economic and conservation interests under CITES. I mean, CITES is, it has a conservation, you know, element, but fundamentally it is a trade regulation. It's about ensuring that trade continues, but continues at sustainable levels. And there's always going to be a disagreement between traders and conservationists over what is sustainability and what is a sustainable level and what species can withstand it. But as I say, I think entities like Species Survival Network are really the first one-stop shop where you can actually get that guidance, where you can begin to grapple with the complexity of an international convention like CITES, because sitting down and reading those documents on your own, I mean, from the last meeting, I think the standing committee meeting, which is generally around the compliance of different countries with the strictures of the convention, there was about 50,000 pages of documents, which realistically, I mean, who has the time? Even if you're an international NGO, you just can't feasibly digest that amount of information, let alone, so I mean, reading it is one thing, understanding it is the next, referring to all of the previous documents that relate to it, and then trying to formulate a strategy of dealing with it. You know, I think the only reasonable, feasible way to engage in processes like that is through coalitions. And so, you know, we're very fortunate with AfA, with Species Survival Network, and I would say that that's pretty much the only reasonable way that we can really engage in these processes at this point. They just become vast, unwieldy, and it takes a team to really tackle these things. Luckily, there are people who are really experienced in this space, who are incredibly generous with their time and expertise. So, you know, I don't mean to make it sound like it's impossible. There are avenues, but I think it really is about teamwork, in the context of CITES in particular. I'm hoping that addressed your question.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very insightful and comprehensive answers. I think in our audience there are a couple of colleagues who would like to share their story from I think Indonesia. Dana, are you ready to share the stories?
Yeah. Hi, can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Well, yep. Well, thank you so much, Sam, for the great presentations. That will be very insightful for us. And I would like to share some infos about the condition in Indonesia. Well, you know, Indonesia is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world and home to species like orangutans, Sumatran tigers and many endemic birds. But however, conservation efforts face really significant challenges due to deforestation, illegal wildlife trade, and habitat loss, driven by large agricultural expansion, particularly in palm oil plantation. And although Indonesia has made strides in conservation, such as establishing protected areas and aligning with international conventions like CITES, still the enforcement remains weak. And this is partly because the penalties under the current criminal code are relatively low, and many law enforcement officers, such as the police, prosecutors, judges, and investigators, lack understanding of how to address crimes against animals. They are often unfamiliar with the classifications of these crimes, and this leading into ineffective enforcement. Additionally, many environmental NGOs have conducted preliminary analysis regarding the need to revise the conservation law in Indonesia. And this law covers a very broad scope, including not only wildlife protection, but also community rights and forest management. Well, this very broad scope, highlights the complexity of conservation in Indonesia, where the protection of biodiversity must be balanced with the rights and livelihoods of local communities. And maybe I would like to ask you some questions about how we can foster more effective partnership between local communities, NGOs, or maybe international organization, and maybe government as well, to address these complex conservation issues in Indonesia. Thank you, Sam.
Sure. Sorry, do you have specific questions, or am I responding to your general
yes,
sort of diagnosis? Yeah.
Well, due to the complex conservation in Indonesia, we need to, think about the community rights also in Indonesia, and forest management also, because we have so many culture here, and we have so many people here, and we have a really large area. So I think it's good if we could build like a partnership between local communities or NGOs and also international organizations, and maybe also with the governments, to address these complex conservation issues in Indonesia. And maybe what kind of strategies that we could try to build the effective partnership between those stakeholders. Do you have any experience on that?
Well, I mean, it's a really weighty question. I mean, obviously, I'm dealing with Hong Kong. It's a city of 7 million, which is probably, I don't even know if it's even as big as Kuala Lumpur. So, like we're dealing with like a small state that's very concentrated. So that does make our work a lot easier in many ways. But that's basically why we find working here so effective, is because everything can be really concentrated. But I think, sort of some general comments and thoughts on the challenges that you're facing. So, I mean, indigenous rights are always going to be very challenging to balance with. Again, I mean, I can't really speak to that element because it's not something that we've necessarily had to reckon with in the wildlife trade space in Hong Kong. I mean, of course, our trade has desperate impacts across the world. I mean, Indonesia included, because of the trade that persists in our city. But it's very difficult to provide any solutions on that basis. I mean, I would say, from what I do know, Latin America has been dealing with very similar challenges, and I would say they've probably come up with some very effective playbooks for balancing and recognizing the rights of indigenous communities, and trying to find ways to balance conservation and communities. But that's really the best I can offer in that particular context. I think I would like to point to some of the stuff that I did touch on in my presentation. So some of the engagement that we've done under the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, I think could be beneficial or a helpful reference, at least for your work. So some of the documentation that's come out from the CCPCJ, again, the worst acronym, they've had a dialogue where they actually put out a consultation to all of the members, all of the United Nations, and about 70 plus states got back to them. And that document is about 200 pages. It's really chunky. But what it is really helpful with doing is it actually explains how many jurisdictions are tackling wildlife crime and where they're investing resources and case studies where they have had sort of effective reforms. So whether that's they've increased a particular penalty. And so I think that could be quite a helpful reference document in trying to basically point out to your local enforcement agents and judiciary and government partners, the precedents that have been set in other jurisdictions. Now it's obviously very difficult because, I mean, unless everybody's under common law, all of the former British-owned states generally are united around a particular legal framework. But of course, that doesn't involve every country on the planet. But I think that there are opportunities to point to other jurisdictions. And I mean, as I say, with EWC, the objective there is really to enshrine in the international policy this principle that then will hopefully make it easier for advocates, within country to say, look, there is actually this call from the international community, this recognition that this is a global problem, that we need a global solution, and that we need to reflect in our own, provincial, state, national, regional policy, and enshrine that ideology, that approach. So that's kind of the two ways I would think about coming at it. I mean, I know it doesn't solve all your problems. And then in terms of coalition building, I mean, the way that we've had success. So I think obviously we always want to involve the government to the extent that they're comfortable. That's excellent. But I think in particularly if this is maybe if you don't have strong trust or relationships with the government already, then I would say that we've had success just bringing together passionate advocates. So I'm really zeroing in on, this is potentially rescue centers, this is NGOs, academics, and other experts who work in the space. And I think once you can bring all of those interests, all of those parties to the table, you can start to figure out, as I said in my presentation, where do you agree, where do you disagree, and that on the points where you all agree, you can start pushing together. And once there's a united voice from, let's say 30 different organizations, it's very difficult for the government to then turn around and say, well, we're not really hearing that this is a problem, because you can say there's 30 organizations and we have public support, and you can coalesce your campaigns and advocacy around that. I'm sorry, I'm speaking, sort of, this is very basic, but I mean, hopefully it is helpful, because we've had real success. I mean, it doesn't always take a really technical solution to solve these problems. I think leveraging the community, whether it's the NGO community or the general public community, has really been a powerful asset for the engagement and work that we've done. So hopefully it could be for you if it's not something you're already doing. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sam, for giving a very informative answers. And you have touched upon very practical points. And thank you, Dinah, for sharing your perspective from Indonesia. And coming up next is another colleagues from Indonesia, Sasha from Synthesia Animals. Sasha, are you ready to share?
Yes, I'm ready.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for the time. So I guess Diana already explained the big picture on what happened in Indonesia, including the issue we usually found here. But firstly, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I can see that you have done a lot for wildlife in Hong Kong. So Synthesia is a new Indonesian animal welfare-based organization. I can say that we have achieved a lot in building a connection and relation with the government, especially Bali government, where we were working on at the moment. But in companion animal movement, we haven't really focused on wildlife working, even though we are in the process of that. And I think Diana, I think actually I have two questions, but you have answered the first one on how to build a strong and trusting relationship with the government. But I can feel that sometimes there is a barrier from the government to be transparent to us, including to what they want and what they want to achieve, what happened in their point of view and in their perspective. Like, do you have any advice on how open that barrier and make the government be more transparent to us? That's my first question. And then the second one, it's about illegal wildlife trade. This is something that I found it very interesting. When you're working especially in Hong Kong, have you ever done any research on why people get involved in this trade? I guess that wildlife, especially illegal wildlife trade, has many stages, and I believe in the lowest stage is the illegal capture, and it might be driven by poverty. But have you ever done any research to know more about that? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I mean, these are fundamental, I think, to tackling and grappling with wildlife crime in particular. So in terms of the transparency, I mean, that's a pervasive issue that I think everybody in every jurisdiction faces. I mean, in Hong Kong, we're quite lucky where we do have a lot of information which is disclosed. So I'm very fortunate to be able to pore through a lot of documents. But I mean, just some general thoughts on how we get information. So I mean, we look through any government domain. So any website that sort of ends with I mean, for us, it's .gov.hk, and we'll do keyword searches across all of the different websites that the government maintains to try and find information that falls under those keywords. And that generally, does yield quite a lot of results. Then we also make use of direct information requests very regularly. So, I mean, I'd say at least once a week, I'm harassing somebody in one of the government departments with a question saying, I see you've made this seizure. Can you give me, really basic information? So for example, for wildlife seizures, we ask, our very first question is, could you provide a breakdown of the volume and the specific species that were involved in the seizure? I mean, this is very foundational information. It's not complicated. It shouldn't be sensitive. But even that, we struggle to find information on a lot of the time. So it really comes down to persistence. And I think it's about asking, I mean, a lot of it is down to luck. It's asking the right person in the right way at the right times. Because, we're all very busy people. If you get an email that sounds interrogative or like it's going to make your life harder, you're not going to be very inclined to respond to it. Unless they have sort of performance requirements. So again, we're very lucky in Hong Kong where the department that we ask most of our questions of has to respond at least with an intermediate response within 2 weeks. So they actually have a performance pledge in terms of responding to general requests for information. And so that could be something that you actually leverage in whatever jurisdiction you're dealing with, if there is a performance pledge from your department. But there's also general hotlines in many instances where you could submit questions. I mean, that's kind of the first pass would be any government website that has, the government domain and might have that keyword appearing on it in some way. And hopefully they're not dealing with like scanned documents, which aren't really searchable, which is an absolute nightmare that I've dealt with before. The next port of call, I think, would be, making direct requests and ensuring that you're directing your questions to the right division. So I think asking around and through that through that process, I think you'll also find yourself interacting with receptive people, because so for us, I mean, we often get, you know, if somebody doesn't want to deal with our question, and they'll said, okay, well, my colleague Fred will deal with you. Luckily, Fred is a lot nicer than, you know, the first person we dealt with, and he might actually become somebody who's willing to provide us information on a regular basis. So I think just firing information towards the government, obviously targeting it to the relevant divisions and departments, so that you're not completely wasting their time. But eventually the information will land on the desk of somebody who has the interest, or might have the inclination, or might have a spare moment, and then they can, you know, hopefully become more of an asset. I know that that's helped us in the past. It's not consistent, it can go away in a second, but that has worked for us historically. We've also had real luck with engaging with the government. You know, when you invite them to events, so if you're able to host workshops, that they feel, you know, if you give them a space to speak and present their perspectives, and it's an opportunity for them to reflect on the positive work that they've done, the positives, is really essential. And that allows them to let their guard down. It gets them out of the office, so they'll enjoy that. But it also gives you the opportunity to have a more open and frank conversation with them in a hopefully a less combative forum, and hopefully that will help you to create, you know, hopefully friendships. I mean, that's the ideal. That's what you really want. So once you can get somebody's WhatsApp number, you can start to build on that relationship. And then I think another resource that you can leverage is, as I mentioned in my presentation, you know, looking at the CITES documentation and also the CCP-CJ documents. A lot of the time there are nuggets of information that are somehow hidden in there, and that might give you some insight into how your country or your province is representing itself in these different forums. And then you can say, well, I see that when you went to Geneva in February, you were saying that you've got this initiative. I would love to learn more about this. And I think if you come at it from, you know, a positive, like, I want to support you in your objectives. I also agree with you, and I believe in the aims that you're trying to meet. I think that that's a much more productive way of engaging. I mean, you can disagree with it personally, but I think if you present yourself as somebody collaborative and supportive, it's far more likely to succeed with government, who are, you know, sometimes they're just there to get a paycheck. They're not ideologically driven a lot of the time, or aligned necessarily with our objectives as conservationists or animal welfare advocates. So, you know, I think all of those things will stand you in good stead. I'm sorry, I'm speaking a lot here, but very quickly to just jump to your other question about sort of poverty reduction. I mean, I think that's really essential, and sort of what motivates people. It's really difficult. I mean, we see a whole host of reasons why people get wrapped up in this trade. I mean, Hong Kong is mostly a transit hub for these things. So most of the people who get wrapped up in it are, you know, they're either enticed or exploited in some way. So it's people, for example, with the rhino horn trade, we see in the courts when people are, you know, they work for Chinese diaspora, people who are of Chinese ethnicity who go to work in an African nation, let's say South Africa. They have a Chinese boss who says, I'll pay for your flight ticket if you just take this product back with you when you return to Guangdong province. And then they don't really understand the implications. They don't understand the regulations. They don't understand the risk. But who's going to turn down a free flight? Because they don't think that there's anything majorly problematic. The boss has probably told them, you'll be fine. And they're willing to roll the dice because it's, you know, it's quite a good incentive for them. So that's one way that we see people get wrapped up in this. Some people run afoul of the law because they're like, well, I like this animal. My son would probably appreciate this gecko. And they get on the flight with an endangered gecko without realizing that they're about to commit an international crime. That's the kind of the generous lower level people, like the generous interpretation of how the lower level people get into it. And then you have, you know, the people who operate at scale, who are the organized criminal sectors. You know, these are you know, people who genuinely have a very good understanding of what they're doing. They are shipping containers of goods between jurisdictions, and they are motivated purely by profits. I mean, fundamentally, if I was to put my finger on one thing that drives all of these people, it is the money. It's, you know, it's either people who don't have money and need it to survive, or it's people who have a lot of money and want more. and have the funds to recruit others to do their dirty work. I mean, fundamentally, money is what is greasing the wheels of this sector. And that's really why we do our private sector engagement, because we've recognized that we have to deal with the financial community. We have to get them on board. They have to be part of the solution, and they have to recognize that illegal wildlife trade is a far greater threat than I think anybody has appreciated up until relatively recently. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't, obviously it's complicated, it's big. There's a lot of reasons why people get involved in this trade, and there's a whole host. But I mean, I think, you know, collective action, operating at whatever scale you can, you know, it doesn't matter what you're doing as long as we're moving in the right direction. And I think collectively we're all making a difference in some small way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for Sam for very, very informative answers. I think I hope that was helpful for Sasha and the situations in Indonesia. I still have a couple more questions, but taking into considerations the time, I think let's wrap up with one or two. So in your presentation, you mentioned the Hong Kong Biodiversity Expert Group, which brings together conservationists, academics, NGOs, and corporate partners to discuss and shape the next biodiversity strategy and action plan. How does this collaborative effort align with the broader goals of the Convention on Biological Diversity, particularly in advancing the implementation of national biodiversity strategies? And what role do you see the expert group playing in ensuring that Hong Kong's contributions are effectively integrated into global biodiversity conservation efforts?
Very technical question, but yeah, I mean, like, absolutely, like that is our objective, is really to make sure that the group is advocating for effective, practicable solutions. Now, at the outset, I would admit, you know, we're not a government entity. We're not a government endorsed entity. This is a coalition that has been created by the community of conservationists, academia, and we are merely submitting our recommendations, you know, as experts in this space to the government. They absolutely could turn around and say, well, we don't believe any of this. There's no merit in anything you've suggested, and we're not going to adopt any of it. But that's what our, you know, longer term advocacy and engagement is all about. And this is why we write reports. This is why we write white papers, why we deal with legislators on a regular basis and try to you know, make sure that there are public eyes on these processes that can sometimes seem very technical and irrelevant to the normal people of Hong Kong, basically. But in terms of trying to align it with the global biodiversity framework, I mean, that's essential to everything we've done. So just from the sort of the genesis, so what we did was we met, I think it was May, maybe April, a very large group of people were invited to this general workshop to kind of say, you know, what are the areas that we need to be working on as a community? Then we set up these focus groups. I think there's about 15 or 16 of these focus groups, which have kind of parceled up different facets of the biodiversity challenges that we face in Hong Kong. And then each of those groups then started to recruit relevant stakeholders to them. So, I mean, I'm in the wildlife trade working group, focus group, sorry, and our focus group has about 25, actually, I think 30. We had 30 members who were all contributing just on this one issue. And then what we've done is we've drafted our recommendations. We've had to distill it from about, I don't know, 30 down to 20, then to 10, then to 5, and now I think we're aiming to try and, because we're trying to amalgamate it with people who have interests in invasive and alien species risks, for example. We're having to combine it because we want to give ourselves the best shot at the government actually adopting the language. And as I say, to your point in your question, we're making sure that all of them really clearly align with the instructions or the principles of the global biodiversity framework. So everything is sort of contextualized within each of those targets. And we've tried to mirror the language of the government. I think that's really key with absolutely any policy advocacy. I mean, the more you use government language, the more they'll recognize it. And the easier it is for them to interpret it and also adopt it, because then, you know, nobody wants to do hard work. So, you know, if you've written something that they can just copy and paste into a document, fantastic. I mean, obviously then they have to panic about how they actually implement it, but I think, you know, try and make their lives as easy as possible. Yeah, hopefully that, you know, in part addresses your question.
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much. Another very informative answers. And also the reason why that question came up is because like many of us know that the CBD is coming up in October. Yeah, and there has been a lot of efforts between organizations, especially Born Free, spearheading a working group with the World Federations for Animals on CBD. And AfA is also like actively supporting that working group with another letter on the SBI4 to prepare for CBD. But hopefully the insights from these questions will help other people understand more about the processes, and maybe sometime in the future consider collaborating on behalf of with Asia for animals and to representing countries for this very important policy instrument. I think the last questions would be a little bit more less technical, and it's about CITES again. So preparing for CITES meetings, such as conference of the parties, COPs, the animals committees, or standing committees meetings can be daunting for organizations with limited experience. Could you share some practical advice or strategies that ADM Capital Foundations has used to effectively prepare for these meetings and navigate their complex agendas?
Oh, well, I absolutely won't pretend that we've cracked the code for that. I think, you know, as I've advocated for before, you know, we really do rely on entities like the Species Survival Network. I mean, it's an incredibly generous outfit that does prepare a lot of the documents, and they are very consultative in the development of their recommendations, for example. So I think it's maybe 2 months out, they'll start to draft a documentation which will reflect on every single agenda item that has come out, and they'll kind of help you to see. I mean, they basically just summarize the information, and you can essentially skim through some of that documentation to get a sense of, you know, if there's particular species or particular countries that you have a concern or an interest in, then that's a great way to start digesting that information. But having said that, everything that comes up at the COPs actually gets discussed at the Standing Committee, the Animals Committee, and the Plants Committee. So that sounds like a lot, but basically there are preceding meetings that happen before the Conference of the Parties, and all of the items that they discuss, that they all agree, all the parties that attend those other committee meetings, they then refer those to the COP. So you get a sense, you know, actually probably, let's say a year out, you get a pretty good sense of what are the likely agenda items that are going to come up. And realistically, the earliest that you can start to engage with the relevant governments, the relevant parties, the better for you, really. I mean, I know that's easier said than done. I mean, we certainly struggle to really dedicate a lot of, you know, brain power and resources to it until, you know, minimum or maximum 2 months out. And it's really difficult because there is a lot of documentation, and some documents don't even come in until, you know, say the week before the conference even begins. But despite all that, I think, you know, engaging in these coalitions is really key. If you're really, really keen and you're willing to read through the documents, you can actually look at the summary records from the Animals Committee and the Plants Committee and the Standing Committee, and then you'll kind of understand broadly what are the issues where parties agreed that these needed further discussion or agreement at the conference, and that's really how I would start in this space. I mean, all the documents are prepared in kind of similar manners. The main challenge, I think, is the volume that you have to deal with. So really zeroing in on issues that are of particular concern to you is essential. So I mean, if you're in Indonesia and you want to deal with Indonesian problems, just look at the documents that relate to Indonesia to begin with, because there's going to be enough to deal with on that front. And you can try to understand sort of where your party or where your country is coming from. For example, if you've got a particular species interest, that actually tends to be a little bit easier because there's only so many agenda items that will deal with a particular species. So yeah, I think being quite targeted, if you're looking to start in the CITES process, being quite targeted with a taxonomic group or a species will probably yield the best results, particularly if you have limited time. And finding allies in that space. There's always reference to who else has been advocating a particular perspective. If you look online, loads of organizations write blogs or something. So you'll get a sense for who's also operating in the space, who has a vested interest in that particular agenda item that you're interested in as well, and you can figure out if maybe they're further along in their thinking than you, and you can align yourself with them. And yeah, everything's about collaboration for me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you so much, Sam. I think that all the attendees today can agree that we learned a lot of information and very useful details today. Thanks to your presentations, answers in the Q&A sections, and also from Zannis and Maya's stories. And we're very grateful for that. And thank you for addressing those questions so thoroughly. And thank you to all our participants for engaging with such important issues today. Before we conclude, I'd like to share some important information about our upcoming events and resources that you might find valuable. Your feedback is very valuable to us. Please scan the QR code to provide your feedback for today's event. And next slide, please. And mark your calendars for our upcoming AfA Connect sessions in November, between November 12th and 13th, with the topic Communications Matters, United Movement.